The Spin-Off Podcast Network.
Whoa. Landing an account this big will totally change my landscaping business. It's going to mean hiring more guys and more equipment and new trucks for the new guys to drive the new equipment in. I don't know if I'm ready.
You can do this, and Ford Pro FinSimple can help. Our experts are ready to make growing pains less painful for your business with flexible financing solutions that meet the needs of your business today when you need them. Get started at fordpro.com/financing.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour government. A podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards the
most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour government. Made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-Off or wherever you get your podcasts.
Nau mai, hoki mai ki other fold, e mihi nei, ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. This is a pilot, a test run at a new format for the fold. I've been talking about this for probably coming up a year, and I just decided actually it's time to stop talking and thinking about it and move it into the just actually doing it phase. Where I was at with the fold was that to explain my thinking, I still want to keep doing the long-form interviews, but have them be a sort of B strand and change the sort of the main weekly thrust of it to be about kind of news and analysis of the media space. I've been increasingly of the opinion that things are moving so fast, so dynamically within both domestic and international media that, you need to be sort of analysing it week to week. Like if you wait for a big event, then a bunch has already changed. So the idea is that if this thing takes, if you guys, if you as our audience enjoy it, and please do let me know, Duncan at thespinoff.co.nz. I would love some feedback on this. But that I will have a small rotating cast of people who I have on, who I enjoy chatting about media with, and we'll just sort of discuss the week's events, but also kind of longer running strands and maybe occasionally deep dive into a particular form of media or issue where the situation allows. So this week we're going to talk about the broad state of New Zealand's media, do a bit of a top line there, some signals that kind of illustrate that, particularly the state of advertising in New Zealand. That's really what's driving a lot of this, and the role of government in media, the changes to Shortland St. Again, there's a little window into the complexities of that. And then we'll finish up with a section that looks at the kind of current state of the big media entities and what potential there is for mergers or acquisitions amongst that group. And my guest to talk about all that is someone who is just incredibly well qualified. It is Glen Kyne, the until very recently head of Warner Brothers Discovery for New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and all of APAC. He's someone I've known for quite a few years and have always found to be one of the most sort of cerebral and reflective people in media, and also someone who, by the nature of his job, was just incredibly plugged into different facets of what's happening locally. But because he was part of one of the biggest media companies in the world, he also understands the sort of strategy and tensions of it in a global sense too. So I'm really excited about this. Glen's going to be coming on regularly to discuss different aspects of the media. So this is a pilot, but I'm really excited about it and hoping that if this gets a good response from our audience. So this becomes the sort of default mode of the fold going forward. So without further ado, this is Glen Kyne on the fold. Kia ora, Glen. Welcome back to the fold.
Kia ora, Duncan. Good to be back.
I'm really excited to be piloting this with you because based on all the conversations we've had on or off mic, there's just so much that you know about this business locally and globally that I think will be fantastic for our listeners. So let's talk about that new news product. Have you? I assume that you've been watching fairly intently.
Glued to it, yes.
What have it does feel like a lot of the kind of worst case scenario predictions of the early period haven't come to pass, and that you are seeing a differentiated, but certainly very kind of plausible news product go to air. What do you make of it, and how it's tracking?
Yeah, I think, gosh, there were so many people, I'm sure, in media sitting around that first Saturday night looking at that bulletin, waiting to talk about it. First of all, huge shout out to Sinead and Laura and Nadia and the team. Incredibly strong first night. As you say, the naysayers, they managed to put them on the sidelines and deliver a really credible bulletin. And I look at the bulletins perhaps differently than a lot of people. I look at them with a sort of technical eye around what's going on, and I can see a number of improvements that are starting to happen already, that they are a learning organisation, learning as they put that bulletin to air. So, even some of the fine training and detail of the graphics, the augmented reality that exists on that set is improving. I'm seeing that the length and story selection is continuing to be trialled to some degree, but improving. The way they are experimenting with, user-generated content with the questionnaires and things that are in the bulletin is really interesting, and no doubt doing a good job back onto the Stuff platform. So, I think they have struck the balance between maintaining something that is comfortable for the viewer, but also starting to innovate. And that was key part of the decision, actually, as we, it was very clear that we needed the bulletin to continue to innovate, particularly into a digital world into the future, and they're doing that.
Did you read Mark Jennings' kind of assessment of it early on?
I've read everyone's assessment of it. I think that, ultimately, I think, the audience has held up pretty well. There hasn't been mass flight away from the bulletin, and that's a testament to the quality of the product. I'm no longer obviously in a position to talk about what's happening from an economic point of view with the bulletin, but I imagine if the audience is there, then the advertising market's pretty content as well.
To the extent that you can, because obviously, like digital, like in terms of audience behavior, is quite a different environment. It's running 24/7. It doesn't have the same kind of peaks and troughs to an extent that linear does. But if you've got, say, 600,000 5+ watching TVNZ at 6 p.m. and another sort of 200,000 watching 3, what are the equivalent numbers for people on TVNZ Plus or 3 now, to the extent, like, even if it's just a broad sense of how many people they have to kind of play with in a digital environment on TVNZ Plus and 3 now?
The way I would probably frame that is that the way the trends are occurring, and they've been occurring for some time, right? So, yeah. But the way the trends are occurring is this year you will see, I think, the growth in digital audience either match or supersede the loss in linear audience. So you'll start to see that happening. That was always a huge milestone for the sector. Now, that's not going to happen 24/7, but you'll certainly see that starting to happen with certain programming, certain events.
So you're saying there'll be more people joining those brands in a digital context than they're losing in a linear context?
Yeah, and part of that is because you're seeing very actively, 3 and TVNZ Plus actively, and aggressively push those digital platforms because they have to. I mean, that is where they need to be. That is where the audience increasingly is. That's where the ad dollars are increasingly going to be. The quicker they get there, the quicker they can transition. There are multiple other benefits for a business being in that environment. You move away from a very high fixed cost base with declining revenues into a variable cost base with growing revenues. You're in a growing market and a growing pool of revenue. I think it's still incumbent on not just the networks, but all the media companies to really reinvent their operating models to be digital first. So rather than just being a traditional media company with a digital platform, be truly digital first. Because one of the things that's coming fast into the sector is the advent of AI, artificial intelligence. And one of the big threats there is that these big global platforms are able to deliver new products and new services at effectively close to, zero marginal cost into the market in New Zealand, which the traditional broadcasters and traditional media companies can't do. So they're going to have to continue to transform themselves and redefine, how they operate into the future. But certainly, the quicker the industry moves to complete digital first, the better.
Yeah. All that being said, that feels like that's a positive milestone, but it doesn't kind of obscure what to me looks like a situation where you're never going to have audiences at the scale they once existed in linear replicated in digital for those brands. Therefore, the local kind of reach, presence, scale of employment, scale of commissioning. Am I missing anything, or is that's not coming back the way it was in a digital environment?
No, I think you're right. I think it's going to be fragmented. Again, there's much more choice in that digital environment. So, of course, the audience is going to fragment. And I think you've seen, to your point around the structure of these organisations, look at 3 now and the changes that were made. I think that's reflective of the scale of organisation of the future. They are smaller, they're more agile, more nimble. But there's a lot of advantages in a digital operating model as well. So we shouldn't think that just because the business is smaller and more nimble and more agile, that is not capable of generating the same amount of shareholder value. It is.
In terms of if you look at the 2 big competitors now, or certainly when the final kind of end of this process is done with WBD, the relative the function for the audience of TVNZ and 3 is fairly similar. You've got a digital platform, you've got some smaller channels associated with it, you've got linear. You've got a new service that plays out at 6 p.m. And yet one of them, the state-owned TVNZ, employs roughly about 4 times as many people. Do you believe that, that is sustainable, or do you think that TVNZ is going to have to go through a process not identical to, but more similar to what WBD went through sometime in the next few years, absent a major shareholder intervention?
Yeah, so much packed into that question, Duncan. I think the TVNZ, have already announced themselves that they've got more cost cutting to do. So I guess it remains to be seen the shape and scale of that. But it's clear that the revenue leaving the market is far greater this year than what they have currently announced with the closure of Sunday and Figo and these things. So more work to be done clearly on that front. I would say, I would speculate that work is ongoing. In terms of the future of their operating model, the minister has signalled that very clearly that he wants them to be a commercially focused organisation moving forward, and that's the way, the Act that they operate under makes that very clear. So unless there's changes to the Act, that will be the course of travel. And I think TVNZ have said that they don't necessarily see a path to profit for a number of years. And they're very focused on the digital transformation. And I think, and again, I'm speculating here, but I think that the model for them will probably looks most like Channel 4 in the UK and the work that Channel 4 have done.
What's that?
So what Channel 4 have done, obviously they're a public broadcaster. And they do capture, obviously, advertising in their business model, but what they've also done is introduced a paywall of sorts where consumers can pay to have the ads disappear from the content. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see something like that to help diversify the revenue so that TVNZ is not solely exposed to ad-funded only revenue because the trends, are not great.
What are the complexities with that? Because, there's also, as I understand it, currently their rights deals when they buy content from overseas don't necessarily allow them to run a subscription service at the same time as an advertising model.
Yeah, it's complex to say the least. It'll depend on the nature of the content that they make available to do that. Certainly, there is content out there from all of the major distributors and studios in the world, pay one content that you pay a premium to have it sit behind a paywall. And a lot of that content in New Zealand at the moment obviously sits with Sky. So to introduce a new layer of content comes with cost implications, but I'm not sure they will do that. They may just, as I said, make the ads go away rather than introducing a paywall or a subscription model necessarily for a different or new user experience. But it remains to be seen. I mean, they have clearly, and you'd argue successfully, made a play in sport, in terms of some of the work they've been doing in that area. But it remains to be seen exactly how they'll execute, that digital transformation of the future. The other interesting thing is, strong balance sheet. They've done well to build up strong cash balance. How strong will that balance be in a couple of years if the market continues to deteriorate? And I think the other big consideration is the cost of tech. You look around the world, right, at the major streamers trying to compete with Netflix. It's a very difficult task, right? The cost of platform is enormous. And so trying to do that from New Zealand and maintain competitive relevance will be an ongoing challenge for any player.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because you sort of, Netflix just announced its results last week and they were pretty extraordinary.
Yep.
In a realm that everyone else is going backwards. Like the number of subscribers and profit both went up, and profit by more than subscribers. So they're getting more out of what they have. Do you, zooming out a bit, do you sort of see that in that streaming space that there's more kind of consolidation to come? Like it seems to me that we've replicated on some level. Like if you subscribe to every streaming service right now, you're paying the same amount as you were for cable, but you're getting less stuff, particularly less sports, which doesn't seem like a great consumer experience. What's your sense of what's likely to there's been speculation about WBD demerging. What's your sense of what's likely to happen with the number of streaming services versus studios supplying into a more consolidated atmosphere over the next few years?
Well, Netflix, I'd argue they're a category entirely of their own these days. And one of the things that Netflix did very early that's made life difficult for all streamers is you would argue they underpriced the service. For the volume and quality of content that was coming through, it was too cheap. And so as others tried to enter the frame and tried to compete with that, it's a very difficult competitive game.
They call it the millennial lifestyle subsidy, what venture capital did throughout the 2010s.
That's exactly right. And so when you look around the world, everyone, from niche players to big players, there are many, many different streaming platforms out there. And I would certainly argue that there is too many. And when you're in a traditional business of trying to maintain a legacy, part of your organization, and also trying to invest in a new growing digital streaming platform, managing those two things in a depressed economy and a depressed environment is very difficult. And so I think that will force some form of consolidation. And, there's a lot of speculation in the public arena out there around who and how that might happen. I was actually really interested in listening to David Ellison talk, who obviously the new suitor and acquirer of Paramount Studios in the US. And He did a press conference a couple of days after the deal was signed, not yet executed. Of course, we've got to wait to see whether that will go through all the regulatory hoops and approvals. But he said the interesting thing about Paramount is that at its core, it's a content creator, and it really needs to get back on focusing at being the best for the creative community that it can be, and producing the greatest creative output. When it comes to the traditional business, the trends are clear. It needs to be managed for cash. And when it comes to streaming, they want to explore what are the other options and business models. And I think that's a pretty clear signal that, trying to go on your own to compete with Netflix is tough, but doing it in partnership and finding new commercial models and pathways is probably something we're going to see.
It's interesting, right? Because, the traditional conception of what is good for consumers is competition, but in a content space, if you had 6 become 3, technology becomes a smaller part because it's less thinly spread, and so plausibly the same amount of money. If the marginal cost of a subscriber is close to zero, so if you're a subscriber to a service with 60 million subscribers versus 30 million, you should theoretically get twice as much content for the same dollar, and technology be twice as good for the same dollar. So there's an argument that you don't want a monopoly, but certainly consolidation to 2 or 3 reasonably well differentiated streamers could be good for audiences, certainly better than this kind of mess of everyone trying to be in a local context. It's almost like a gentailer. We're a retailer of content and of power and a generator of power.
Yeah, I think it's just common sense, right? When you have got duplicate platforms that duplicate marketing, tech, all the costs that go into supporting these things. If you can remove the cost of duplication through partnership, and then focus that investment back into creative output, that's a great thing for the consumer. Really positive experience.
Kia ora, this is Toby Manhire, here to urge you to tune in to Gone by Lunchtime, a podcast with me, Annabelle Lee Mather and Ben Thomas, tackling the world of New Zealand politics, from policy to polling, from scandal to psychodrama. Listen to Gone by Lunchtime, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network, wherever good pods are sold.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, Senior Writer at The Spin-Off. We wouldn't exist without the ongoing support of our generous members. If you're able to, you can make a donation at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
So let's talk about that in a local context, right? Because we have a vaguely similar situation here in that we're a comparatively tiny economy, smaller than a lot of Australian states, and yet we've got Sky, we've got NZME, we've got Stuff, we've got MediaWorks, we've got WBD, Whakaata Māori, RNZ, which are less in a sort of a related but different part of the media economy. Do you think that consolidation is inevitable, desirable in the local context too?
Yeah, I think partnership and or consolidation is probably the way that I would frame that. I think that one of the issues in New Zealand is, I think we've talked about this before, is scale. You get to a certain point in terms of distribution or reach of your media platform and there's little else to go. And if you're not an international player that can monetize, your investments overseas, there's this kind of natural ceiling. And that's been exacerbated in certainly the last 5 to 10 years as the international platforms have come in, which has meant that the local media players are doing great work and doing very well, but while the pie is increasing, they're becoming a smaller part of the pie. And so, if you're a CEO out there in media, one of the things that you're constantly thinking about is, yes, I've got to tightly manage and control my cost base, but also where's my growth coming from? And one of the ways to do that is to look to find complementary assets that you can put together in the market that give you that growth story, or indeed complementary partnerships like what you've seen with WBD and Stuff, where both parties can win by putting, a particular partnership together. And already we've seen out of that particular partnership things like the America's Cup come together in partnership, and I think you'll see more of that. But yeah, I think that, to compete against the globals, either consolidation of complementary assets or partnerships that make sense are going to be critical. Incredibly difficult to do. Different cultures, different incentives, all of those things make them difficult. But I imagine there's lots of those discussions probably underway.
Are there any that sort of leap out where you can see that there's just a natural synergy that, I mean, it's obviously there's Commerce Commission, there's shareholders, these things are not uncomplicated as you alluded to, but anything that kind of sort of seems like it just intuitively makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I could speculate. It's interesting. I think the Stuff WBD partnership is really interesting on where the potential of that partnership could go and what they could do. NZME has a fantastic balance sheet. It's been very well managed, by Michael and his team have done an excellent job for a number of years. And so, NZME certainly have the opportunity to buy or acquire or to invest. They haven't done that to date. One of the interesting things is if you're going to buy something in New Zealand, what do you buy to get increased scale that's going to give you genuine benefit versus just continuing to be operationally excellent in your field? But I would expect to see NZME continue to be looking. Stuff also, Sophie and the team have done a great job managing their cost base and creating shareholder value through
Sky here.
Have done an incredible job of managing the cost base to create shareholder value for the last couple of years. No doubt they'll be thinking about how do they then, leverage that strength into also opportunities that they can see. Whether that's in the sport or entertainment space remains to be seen. They've got obviously a very big negotiation coming up or underway, which is going to be pretty, I think, a large determinant of how they operate into the future.
It's quite interesting, right? Because the last time that we're talking about the New Zealand Rugby rights deal, the last time that came up for negotiation in a local context was a really different environment. You had Spark Sport there, and it was a relatively more robust environment. In some ways, Sparks exited the sports market. TVNZ, even if it wanted to, it would be it would be optically not great for it to be involved in any meaningful way with rugby. So, on that basis, you can imagine Sky thinking we might be able to get involved in this for less money than the previous deal. But at the same time, New Zealand Rugby's just had a huge external investment come in. It's trying to kind of and sports rights globally, we witnessed the recent NBA deals have been going up. How do you, and it's launched NZR Plus, in some ways that looked like a signal that if Sky couldn't get to a number, then it might go direct. And so how do you see that aspect of it playing out? It's a really, really interesting kind of delicately poised economy for sports rights right now.
I think you've laid it out beautifully. I will be a very keen observer to see how it plays out. Look, I don't think there is any room for a broadcaster to take on those rights. The cost of those rights, there's no payback, right, in a traditional linear broadcast sense for that. Could the rights be split in some way, potentially? Could there be a partnership put together, potentially, that splits those rights and distributes value differently, which means that Sky may get a reduced investment, but have a partner come to the table with a set of rights, and New Zealand Rugby is still getting what it wants. I mean, look, I'm speculating, but these will be the sorts of things that are being looked at by the parties, I've got no doubt at the moment. How it all shakes out, I don't know. I think, look, NZR Plus is a great international tool for those that can't access All Blacks content in the games. It will be, if you're an expat Kiwi living overseas, you've probably got NZR Plus downloaded on your phone. So very helpful to be able to stay in touch with the All Blacks. Domestically, obviously, the Sky platform is the predominant platform in Sky Sport now of where you're going to see those games. And, one of the interesting things about sports rights, and I'm a big believer that, sports rights primarily for the major leagues, at least in the major sort of franchises, do need to sit behind a paywall. Because when you look at New Zealand, the role that perhaps they don't get enough credit for, but, the amount of money that Sky puts into rights, and particularly New Zealand Rugby, it is funding a lot of grassroots development of a lot of sport in New Zealand. And they're the only ones with an economic model that can sustain that. If you take that away, it's a struggle to see how anyone else could return that money into the actual games and sports that Sky are funding through their broadcast rights.
I guess the sort of flip side of that is that by having it paywalled, even in Sky's height, it was in 1 in 2 New Zealand households, so half the population didn't get to see it. So it feeds the grassroots, but it also prevents the next generations, half of the next generations, of having access to the product. So, if you think about what the last 20 years has looked like for New Zealand sport, the likes of rugby has felt like it's lost its grip on the whole of the country, and sports like UFC, basketball have become vastly more popular, in part because while the games or the pay-per-views might not have been accessible, the content, the personalities, the connection to it, the highlights were more so. And that almost feels like the big opportunity for both Sky and New Zealand Rugby is to make the product somehow, even if the bulk of it or the most valuable parts of it stay behind a paywall, it still has to feel accessible in a way that it hasn't historically done as a product for the whole of the market.
Yeah, Sky have been vocal this year about Super Rugby having its largest audiences for many, many years, and I think part of the reason for that is they've created a window on Sky Open, their free-to-air channel, and so and Sky have been actively doing that with a number of sports. The partnership with netball, with TVNZ, State of Origin with 3 historically around creating these free windows, which are helping create awareness and exposure to bring bring New Zealand into these various sports. And I think they'll continue to try and find whether they can do it via their own free-to-air channel or do it via partnerships. They'll continue to do that. At the same time, I expect them to continue to make strong investments and create increased accessibility for their streaming product.
I mean, this might be a bit awkward given your very recent role with the company, but do you see that, because Sky Open is one thing, it was until recently known as Prime, it didn't feel like it was particularly core to Sky's business, but as it increasingly looks at ad revenue as a big part of what it does, and, there's probably a ceiling on how big Sky Open can get, but, if WBD were to decide, actually, we're not, our core business is studios and potentially streaming, but a free-to-air linear channel, albeit a different platform like a 3Now in a small country isn't core to what we're doing. Can you see Sky picking up something like the local assets of WBD and 3Now and using that to create both a free-to-air digital play and have a much more prominent channel to put this content through? Does that sort of, that feels like a meaningful change to Sky's outlook in a way?
Look, ultimately, Duncan, those are questions now for Sky and for WBD to answer, so I won't comment. But what I would say is the nature of that kind of goes back to what we were talking about before around consolidation in the market and finding the right partners or consolidation options, and it's about complementary assets. And if you can put assets together that complement and give you a genuine growth strategy in a sector of the market that you're not currently participating, you need to be looking at that right now. Otherwise, it's just going to be a purely cost-focused strategy, which can only get you so far.
The hard thing, right, is that Sky was looking a couple of years ago at just something like this in terms of the MediaWorks acquisition and their shareholders, which feels like, it's a publicly listed company, but those invariably are dominated by a relatively small number of kind of significant shareholders, or at least noisy shareholders, and they effectively shouted that deal down. Does that impinge on Sky's ability to move dynamically? Because you've got to think, if you do have a strong balance sheet, which it does, just as NZME does, but also publicly listed, now's the time to go shopping. You've got assets which you should hope will recover their value at probably bargain prices. And if you are confident in your ability to be operationally execute, as you said before, you'd think now is the time to be buying. But it does require your shareholders to kind of back your administration effectively and say, well, we believe that you can do this.
Yeah, I think you're right. Timing is good now. I think from a shareholder perspective, you look at it, is this going to be complementary, i.e., is it going to contribute to growth or contribute to income in some way that's meaningful? So those very obvious business questions, need to be asked and answered. But I think it is tricky, in New Zealand, as we've talked about, to find opportunities that give you genuine growth and scale, and not just in the short term where you're buying a revenue hit for a year or two, but give you genuine competitive advantage into the future against what is going to be a rapidly changing landscape. But clearly, there are complementary assets out there for the parties, all parties to be looking at and talking about. And I've been saying for a number of years, Duncan, that partnerships are core to the future of local media, because the only way you're going to scale and compete is by reaching audiences, at an equivalent scale as the way Google, Meta, others are. And if you can't do it on your own, you're going to need to partner or consolidate.
So we're almost out of time, but one thing which I did want to talk about, and it's actually probably deserves its own episode, but let's just take a little fragment of it actually, is that one of the complicating factors in all this is that the government is a very large player in the sector, both as a regulator, a decider of the environment that we operate in, but also in the owner of one of the biggest properties. And you recently saw in 2 announcements around Shortland Street just how much it's willing to put its thumb on the scale for its own properties in a way that, certainly I'm sure that, News Hub would have loved to have been seen as crucial infrastructure in the same way that Shortland Street was. Just to top line what happened there, I think it was on a Tuesday, Paul Goldsmith announced that Shortland Street was going to, basically they were going to change the rules for the screen production grant in a way that a single program suddenly became eligible, and that program was Shortland Street. So that was great for TVNZ. That's effectively a 40% contribution to its costs. Later in the week, New Zealand On Air, another part of the government, announced that it was putting in $3 million to Shortland Street at the same time as TVNZ was announcing it was reducing it to 3 days a week. So the total savings for TVNZ were well north of 50%, well north of it, while still getting to retain this very sort of important property, particularly for TVNZ Plus and TVNZ2. Yeah, what did you make of that as an episode, and how does it illustrate the complexities of, the government being regulator and shareholder in a market like media?
Well, they're more than that. They are a regulator, they are a shareholder owner, they are the biggest advertiser in New Zealand, and they are the biggest funder of program, right? So they are, they are everywhere. And so, yes, a whole topic on its own to talk about the impact of that. But look, specific to Shortland Street, it's interesting. So I certainly understand the case from the production community. When you've got a depressed economy the way that we have, and the impact through to broadcast revenues in particular, it's been devastating for the production community because the networks have not been commissioning new shows, new formats. And so that puts at risk jobs, that puts at risk companies. There is a economic consequence to that flows beyond just broadcast. So I understand the rationale. The tricky thing with this one is it's limited to one program. And I think the minister came out himself and said later, probably in hindsight, it probably is the only program that's ever going to get this. Now, if you're if you're a different production company than SPP, not producing, you're probably looking at this going, what can I get? And if you are, another broadcast network, you're looking at this going, this is interesting because all this money is flowing to the bottom line, ultimately, of TVNZ to help them out, right, in terms of their future. So
it was interesting, right? Just to interrupt as an aside, when they first announced it, before I saw that it was limited to scripted, I thought this could capture news,
Yeah.
But they really deliberately drew it in a way that it could only be Shortland Street.
That's right. And so, there's never going to be another piece of content probably ever like that in broadcast ever again. The only thing that would come close to that would be something like Country Calendar, probably. But there's nothing else in the landscape or environment that's going to, secure funding in that way. So, lots of people, I'm sure, scratching their heads a little bit. Partly good because, from my understanding, Shortland Street funds nearly 400 jobs, so that's great. But I guess from an equity point of view for the rest of the sector and the rest of the industry, it probably leaves a few questions remain unanswered.
Well, that's probably a good place to leave this episode with plenty of questions still unanswered. I really enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to digging deeper on a lot of these topics in future episodes. But thank you so much for coming up, Glen, and look forward to chatting more in future.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Duncan.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBet.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.